I'm super excited to be able to welcome all of you to our second quarter broadband series. As some of you may know, Alliant Energy, along with the foundation, started this model and this project to really be able to share and talk about some of the key issues that have come up not only after COVID, but understanding the importance of technology and the bridging the digital divide across all of our communities. And for Alliant Energy, who services real rural communities in both Iowa and Wisconsin, giving an opportunity to be a player in the space is extremely important. And today's session is even more critically important because we have representatives from both states here to share their expertise, what they're doing in their day-to-day work to help bridge the digital divide. And so I'm super excited to present our panelists today. With us today, we have Alyssa Kenny, the State Broadband and Digital Equity Director for the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. We also have hot off the press, Dr. Matt Burns, who was recently confirmed as the permanent Chief Information Officer for the state of Iowa. So congratulations, Dr. Burns. And also Liesl Siebert, Rural Community Revitalization Program Manager within the Center for Rural Revitalizations at Iowa Economic Development Authority. Liesl, you're testing all my English skills at this point. But thank you to each of you for joining us and all of you who are making the time to be with us today. The session today, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give a brief introduction of themselves. Then each of our panelists will present a short PowerPoint about some of the work they're leading. And then we'll move over to some question and answer conversation. If you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat, and we'll try to get to those before the end of this session at 1 o'clock. So without further ado, Alyssa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon. My name is Alyssa Kenny. I'm the State Broadband and Digital Equity Director here at the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin, and I oversee the work of the Wisconsin Broadband Office and also the telecommunications team. And I think you can go right to the next slide, please. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of the Wisconsin Broadband Office. We have a vision that all Wisconsinites have the information technology capacity needed to fully participate in society. And so this is broadband access, this is broadband adoption, this is broadband affordability, this is the devices, this is the skills, this is the entire sort of package. And our mission and where we really focus our work is to make high performance broadband more accessible, ubiquitous, and affordable in Wisconsin. And so these are the sort of driving goals of our office. And then under that, we have some sort of measurable goals that we've been measuring progress on over the years. We're looking to have a resilient Wisconsin. And so that's all communities with at least 1 gigabyte per second to their communities. So not every institution needs that, but every community needs that. Accessible, with all Wisconsin residents having access to above 25.3 service. Affordable, with 75% of Wisconsin residents with households below 200% of poverty being able to access the internet for $25 per month or less. And then performance, and that's where we're really focusing on the speed of the broadband and that people have symmetrical service of 100 by 100. And so those are kind of where we're focusing our energies and where we're doing our measurable goals. Can I move on to the next slide? And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of the goals and strategies that we are using within our office and within the commission to reach those goals. The first is leadership and vision. We see the digital divide and digital equity as solvable problems. We believe with like the right energy, coordinated resources, that this is a solvable problem. It is not a persistent problem. It's something that is achievable. And that takes vision, leadership, coordination, public and private investment. All things data and maps, I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but to really solve the problem, it needs to be well measured, well tracked, the precise location of service, the precise cost of service, the quality of service needs to be known and understood on an incredibly granular level for us to do the best work we can do as a state. One of the exciting things that recently happened in Wisconsin, I'll just add as a side, is we just put out an RFP for a broadband intelligence product where we're planning to complement our voluntary granular data collection program with some commercial data that the state's planning to purchase. And then strategic investment in infrastructure, and this is what the state of Wisconsin and our office is often most known for. We have a grant program where we give out broadband expansion grants, and those are to unserved and underserved areas in the state. On June 23rd, just last month, the commission awarded the largest grant round in the history of the state at $125 million. And that's going to go to another 87,000 locations getting service in the state, and that's in addition to the 300,000 locations that are already under construction, under contract, under grant agreement to get service through broadband grants. And finally, or not finally, we have a digital equity and inclusion framework. We have a stakeholder group. We focus on outreach to the Affordable Connectivity Program, doing things so we can reduce those barriers, understand people and communities who have barriers to accessing broadband that are different than the availability of service and the availability of infrastructure, and make sure that we're designing our programs and strategies to reach those Wisconsin residents too. And finally, like I said at the top, our office is small, and we need partnerships, and we need across the state and across public and private entities to really reach these audacious goals that we have. Next slide, please. Wisconsin has a few programs. I've mentioned some of them already. We have our expansion grants. We also did ARPA grants with the American Rescue Plan Act dollars. Everyone in the future will be doing BEAD grants, so there'll continue to be an influx of money. We have a couple of community certification programs, so communities can really reduce any permitting burdens and kind of roll out the welcome mat to providers that they're looking. Our office did a lot of work on COVID response, authorizing CARES grants, and also standing up a phone and internet helpline to help people who are disconnected who needed assistance on the phone. And then we've had a broadband connectors pilot where we did technical assistance to communities looking to develop their broadband plan. So those are some of our current programs. I'm sure in the future our programs will change as funding changes and federal resources become available, but that's what the state office has been working on. Can I have the next slide, please? And then we have some resources and tools that we provide. We operate the Wisconsin Broadband Map. We have 100+ internet service providers in the state of Wisconsin, and we map their coverage. Many of them, about 60 of those 100, provide data directly to our office on a voluntary basis, and most of them do it at a granular level, and that gives us some more accurate data about where service is. We're staffed to the Governor's Task Force on Broadband Access, and the report was just released yesterday publicly. If people want to go grab it, it's out on the Governor's website and the Public Service Commission's website. It makes recommendations about how the state can move into the future. And then again, helping communities and organizations really lift up digital equity and inclusion practices and use them as a planning lens. Next slide, please. And then I would just say right now what our office is working on and what I think all broadband states are working on is really preparing for bill. I've heard some people call this IJA, but the infrastructure law, and particularly the Internet for All. And I just on the next slide just have a really quick overview of kind of what's coming nationally. And this is from NTIA, the federal agency, but as you can see, there's about $65 billion that will be coming in broadband funding across a number of programs, a bunch of it directly to states for both broadband deployment and digital equity. And states are doing all the work they can do to prepare for deploying these dollars. And so increasing our capacity, improving our data, developing plans to really deploy those dollars in a way that's going to achieve the highest possible level of both broadband deployment and broadband adoption in the state. And so that's really where we're focusing our energy as the state of Wisconsin right now, sustaining those state programs that have been really successful and preparing for the federal expectations that are coming with the Infrastructure Act. And with that, I can pass it off.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for that information, and taking notes, so we'll have some fruitful dialogue afterwards. And without further ado, Dr. Matt Burns, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be with all of you today and talk a little bit about Iowa's journey from a broadband standpoint and some of the things that we'll be rolling out in connection with some of the programs that Alyssa mentioned at the federal level as we think about the next year or so and what we want to do. I decided, rather than to do a giant overview of all the different components of our office from a broadband standpoint, what I really want to be focusing on is how we intend to increase community engagement in the decisions that we make about the allocation of broadband funding in the future. So that's a little bit about what I'll discuss today. So next slide, please. So I represent the Office of the Chief Information Officer. That's me, and we run, in addition to being the state CIO, I'm also responsible for administering Governor Reynolds' Empower Rural Iowa broadband program. And so I've been involved in those programs since about 2015. And in that capacity, you know, we are running a number of things simultaneously. We do a grants program. We also have a mapping program where we're, you know, setting forth the availability or the service conditions in the field across the state of Iowa. And we also do a lot of coordination. And then there are some other smaller programs as well. We do a property tax exemption program for broadband plant, and we also have a program that provides information about open ditches for the installation of conduit, kind of a dig once program across the state that sort of shows state road construction projects and where opportunities might exist for broadband providers to install new capacity. And we also have a number of contractors that assist us on this journey that provide consultation, local coordination, and support. So next slide, please. We've been doing this for a while. I've officiated 7 grant opportunities in the state, and those have all happened just since 2018. We have awarded approximately $350 million in both state and federal funding. So you'll see programs from us that are entirely state funded. The most recent one was $100 million of state funding. And then you'll see some federal programs. I announced the awards in January for, I think it was around $200 million of projects associated with federal funding streams. So we do a little bit of both here. And of course, annually we release a new map of the state of Iowa. And one of our challenges, of course, when we're looking at both state and federal programs, is that the criteria for eligibility often diverge between what the Iowa legislature sets forth as eligibility requirements and what different federal programs set forth. And of course, different federal programs diverge on some of those requirements between each other. And so there's a real complex effort that we undertake to try to make eligibility determinations based on what some of these different funding requirements are. And then that map, once it's officially adopted, becomes the basis for those determinations going forward. This summer, we'll be releasing a new map of the state of Iowa. And I can't remember if I talk about that on a later slide, but I'll mention it now. And you'll be able to find that on our website when it's published. We are moving from census blocks, which we've done for the past 4 map rounds. Those of you familiar with census blocks, they're geographic areas of varying size that are, you know, identified to support decisions really concerning elections as much as anything else. But we are moving from those blocks where we say the conditions of service in that block, served or it's unserved, for example, to locations. So on the map that we'll be releasing this summer, you'll see 1.5 million locations across the state of Iowa. These are structures based on NextGen 911 data and the conditions of broadband availability that are reported to exist at those individual locations. So much more granular in an effort to help solve some of the long-standing problems associated with census block geometry. It's way in the weeds, but there are problems with census blocks. It's enough to know that. But also to put the state of Iowa in a position to challenge the federal government, or the FCC specifically, their map that will be released later this year. And so we want to make sure that if the FCC believes that an Iowa home or business is served, and we believe it is not, and we have evidence to say that it isn't, that the FCC gets that information from us so that their map can be as accurate as possible. Next slide, please. So we know this new federal funding is coming. Melissa already mentioned some of those things. All the states are facing the same new infusion of federal money under the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the IIJA, depending on what you want to call it. There are two key programs among several. I think there are 6 programs, in fact, but 2 that we're really focused on. One is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, and the other is the Digital Equity Act, which are doing different things. So when we think about BEAD, we're really thinking about access. When we think about Digital Equity Act, really thinking about adoption. And increasingly, what we like to advocate for people is the term digital divide is becoming a little old-fashioned. In fact, what we see across society are multiple divides that are across lots of different types of considerations, different social considerations, different economic considerations. And the Digital Equity Act is really designed to think about some of those things. There's divides in awareness about the importance of broadband. There are divides in digital skills. There's divides in your ability to afford a connection. And there's, of course, divides in your ability to access a connection at all. But we want to think about all those divides holistically as we continue on our journey towards more broadband availability and greater digital equity in the state. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we'll be releasing new maps this summer, and that's in preparation for FCC maps that will be announced. And those FCC maps are going to govern the amount of money that each state gets. Next slide, please. So having done 7 of these grant opportunities in the past, we're kind of at a point in time where we can reflect a little bit on what we did right and what we did wrong, to gather feedback from Iowans all over the state who may want to share their perspectives on how well we did. We know we're not perfect, and we have room to grow and be better. And we want to take this opportunity as we prepare for federal programs to become as good as we can be. So we know we've had some problems over the last 7 rounds of grants. And one is that communities in the state really haven't had a voice in the distribution of funds. So in a traditional grant program, I'll publish a map of the state, and broadband providers can choose to build more or less wherever they want to build. So as long as the area is eligible, a provider can circle that area and submit it in a grant application. And that has resulted, that program of effort has resulted in substantial build out across the state. That $350 million of investment turned into nearly $700 million of new build out. But it also turns out that a lot of times the most convenient and economically viable areas are often being identified in applications. And so that creates a perception that some areas perpetually go without funding. And so we want to try to solve that problem. And we also know that new federal programs, the BEAD program and the DEA program I mentioned earlier, are going to require an enormous amount of community coordination, community engagement, collaboration, and so forth, not only at the beginning of the development, but continuously throughout the life cycle of these programs. So we're starting to think now about how we build some of these community engagement pillars. Next slide, please. So we're contemplating at this point, it's not finalized yet, but kind of an expanded process for 2022 to 2023. We've always done a map. That's in that first phase. And what we do with the map is Iowa has well over 200 broadband providers. We contact all of them and gather data. We then host an appeal process, and that's open to anyone in the public. And we're preparing that appeal process right now that will permit gathering of additional information from the public and from communities. Cities and county governments can submit and so forth. So we're going to be gathering that data. And it's more right now, we're more interested in, not just interested, forgive me, in whether or not the map is correct on the conditions of availability, but also whether the broadband service that the individual is receiving is reliable. So we're going to be gathering some additional and affordable. So we're going to be gathering some additional information from the public through the appeal process to begin to try to understand those factors. What's new for us is this step 3, where we're contemplating a community identification and planning process. And that process will allow, rather than having providers kind of pick where they want to go, this process is just for communities, city and county governments, school districts, consortia of political subdivisions, nonprofit organizations representing communities, that sort of thing, to go to our map and draw where those entities believe have the most urgent need for broadband funding. And then we're going to prioritize those based on the information that's given to us. We're going to score them. We're going to create a rank order. And then we're going to issue, in the last step, funding opportunities associated with each of those areas. Now, what's that really changing is that gives communities a say in where the broadband funding is going to go. You, the community, is going to tell us where you think the urgent need is. And then we'll issue an RFP for someone to build to all of the unserved and underserved locations within that area. Next slide, please. Now, the map appeal process that I mentioned kind of looks like this arrow. We're going to issue the map this summer. There's this opportunity for the public to tell us, members of communities, broadband providers, and anyone in the public, residents, to tell us that the map's wrong so that we can make it better. We'll then go through an appeal process and we'll adopt the final map. And we're going to be soliciting lots of other kinds of evidence, as I mentioned, including a variety of affidavits from residents, speed tests, all kinds of different things that'll help inform the conditions of the map, because it's our responsibility to reflect a map that represents the conditions on the ground as represented to us by Iowans. And so we're going to try to make the best map we can with the information we get from everyday people in Iowa who are living their own broadband journey. Next slide, please. That community identification process that I mentioned will come out later this year, and that's called an invitation to qualify. And again, that's where the communities would come out and tell us, draw an area that says, I'm self-identifying that this area should be prioritized for funding. And we're going to gather lots of information through that process. First, we're going to gather the geographic area, and then we're going to ask questions that connect to different federal programs. So we're gathering information from communities throughout that process about things like impediments to work, education, and health monitoring. You know, that area that you drew may be in a school district that has a one-to-one program where the high school students all receive a laptop to go home. But guess what? They don't have an internet connection. So they got to turn around and drive to the library or to a McDonald's to get Wi-Fi access. We want communities to be telling us those stories. And then we'll be asking about other things, you know, support from different community groups, types of things that can be contributed by a community to help make a broadband project go faster. This could be in-kind contributions, or it could be financial contributions. You know, an in-kind contribution in this context might be, you know, community owns a rural water district and they are willing to grant a no-cost easement for the placement of a wireless transmitter on a water tower. It could be anything like that that would help make a project go faster. And then some barriers to broadband, reasons that, you know, broadband hasn't come to this location yet. And there'll be other things that we'll collect through that process as well to help support both an information gathering effort by our office, but also some of the underlying tenets of the broadband programs at the federal level. Next slide. So one thing we know for sure as we move into this approach is that community participation is critical. So we've been doing a lot of outreach over the last month or two to different community groups, representatives of cities and counties, to kind of share this message, to say this program is all of us working together. We're going to solve broadband in Iowa. We're going to establish, you know, we're going to set a roadmap for digital equity by working together and kind of joining hands and everybody trying to solve this problem. So if you're interested in participating, you can certainly contact our office at the email address below and begin thinking about gathering information that could be useful either for the map appeal process or for the invitation to qualify. And then this summer, you'll begin to see the map roll out and then the invitation to qualify to follow from there. So thank you again for the opportunity to visit with you and looking forward to your questions after Liesl is finished.
Thank you, Dr. Burns, for that, and loved all the community aspects of it. So I'll be asking you a couple more questions on that front once we get to that portion. But without further ado, Ms. Liesl Siebert, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Very excited to be part of this panel. I am coming at it from a little bit of a different perspective. So I don't work directly with kind of broadband providers, aside from some of the work that I do with the Governor's Empower Rural Iowa program, which Matt mentioned. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that program and then what that task force has been recommending and kind of what we are planning to do moving forward, which is a little bit more on the leveraging of that technology rather than the actual expansion. So next slide. As I mentioned, I am Liesl Siebert. I am with the Iowa Economic Development Authority Center for Rural Revitalization. And through that role, I manage the Governor's Empower Rural Iowa initiative. That initiative was created by executive order in 2018. And then actually my role was a direct outcome of their first year of recommendations of task forces. And that was to develop a kind of a position within state government that was solely focused on rural. So I started in this position in 2019. The interesting thing about Empower Rural Iowa, it is a partnership with the Iowa Rural Development Council. So it's a very interesting kind of outside nonprofit and then government partnership. It is co-chaired by the Lieutenant Governor as well as the Rural Development Council past chair, Sandy Ehrig. So we kind of have that really great balance of kind of on the ground rural community members on the task forces, but also the Rural Development Council has those kind of statewide providers on a wide variety of topics. And then as part of the development of Empower Rural Iowa was the creation of 3 task forces to develop recommendations annually for the governor. Next slide. And of those 3, there is the Investing in Rural Iowa Task Force, Growing Rural Iowa, and Connecting Rural Iowa. As you might imagine, I'm going to focus on connecting, but I did want to mention the other 2 because Empower really looks holistically at kind of the rural environment and how all the pieces work together. So investing, that group has really looked at everything from rural housing shortages to how to support entrepreneurs, how to help businesses have online business presence, business succession planning, those type of things. Growing has really focused on rural leadership development, as well as supporting and recruiting new people to work and live in rural communities and kind of what that looks like. And then finally, Connecting has really focused on that broadband connectivity. That task force really is made up a lot of providers, as well as some economic development representatives and other just interested and passionate rural people who recognize the need for broadband throughout their region. Next slide. So every year, the task forces have a series of meetings. They hear from experts. They kind of develop a list of recommendations for the governor. These can be everything from policy recommendations to maybe more internal programmatic changes at the state level that can help to enhance or empower our rural areas. So the Connect Task Force has really focused on how to strengthen the existing broadband grant program that Matt talks so much about. And Matt has really been such a great partner with the task force. I think he meets probably with the task force multiple times a year to share information and share progress and kind of have good communication back and forth. So this very much is a partnership and between the 2. So you can kind of see how some of the recommendations over the past few years have been reflected in what Matt talked about as far as what they are implementing. So some of those map changes we have seen, some of the changes to the grant program as far as kind of a structure of if you're providing a higher level of service, potential to receive more grant funding. Things like that have been some of the recommendations that have come out of the task force. But then as we have met in the past couple of years, we've shifted a little from just providing recommendations on this program to how we can actually kind of work with communities to understand how to better leverage the technology once they have it. Next slide. So Wisconsin mentioned that they already have this program. We are developing a Broadband Forward and Telecommuter Forward certification program. So it was created by legislature in 2021 with no funding, but we are working on actually developing the program so that it's ready to launch once we have some funding for it. But that would have the ability for those communities that really do have the technology in place to be able to really market that to businesses, to homeowners that are interested in kind of requiring a certain level of service before they are willing to move to an area. And we do, I mean, you heard Matt say we have over 200 providers. We have some really excellent local telco areas. There are many rural communities that have much better service here in Iowa than I do in my suburban neighborhood. And there needs to be a better way to market that. So we're looking forward to those certifications being on the books and being able to share that. And then this year, the task forces have really been focusing on continuing to tell those stories and to talk about some best practices to continue to work with Matt and his team on how to have that community side of things. We're really excited about that direction that OCIO is going and think that that's going to really kind of move us even further forward. And we're also working on how to help with technical assistance programs. I didn't mention that another part of my role is to implement other outcomes. So very happy that the broadband program is with Matt, but there are a few other grant programs that are smaller that are housed within the Center for Rural Revitalization, and some of those do support kind of small activation type connectivity programs. So we're not talking about laying broadband, but maybe helping to expand free public Wi-Fi type projects is something that we have been working with other rural communities and creative ways to help increase access to that technology. So I think that was the last of my slides, and looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much to all three of you for sharing all the information. I know we got a little technical at times, but I think people, when they hear broadband, right, they don't understand sometimes the intricacies when we're talking about connectivity or access or affordability. So before I jump into some of the questions I have, I'd like to open it up to anyone here on the audience, because I think it's important that we make this as interactive as possible. So I see one hand up, Ted Stopoulos from our Public Affairs Office out in Iowa. Ted?
Thanks, Griselda. Matt, thanks for your remarks. Really appreciate the presentation. Just kind of had two quick questions for you. One with respect to the Iowa specific map that you had referenced that your team is taking a look at making in response to the FCC map. Just curious on timing. Presumably the FCC will want to probably challenge whatever map the state comes up with. Just curious on what that timing of appealing and kind of when can we expect, you think, a final map throughout that process? And the secondary question would be, just at a high level, are you hearing anything with respect to any legislation being filed next session on broadband, on any topics within broadband? Thank you.
Yeah, so taking these in turn on the on the timelines for our map, we're hoping it will be within the next 30 days. We have a number of different kind of moving pieces. So as recently as a week and a half ago, the FCC released new challenge codes that it will be using for its own mapping challenge process. And so we have an exercise to integrate our map so that it's positioned to be used to challenge the FCC's map. So this definitely this summer, I think we'll be ready to release it. The FCC, well, it's our understanding at this time that what the FCC will be doing is sort of a two-part challenge process. The first part concerns the underlying location fabric. So what is a location fabric? It's a fancy word for meaning all these little dots that sit over the top of houses across the United States. It's always possible that a dot could be missing. Like we didn't show in whatever data collection ever we did that home exists. It's also possible that that dot is 300 yards to the east of where the home actually is. So there'll be a challenge process with the FCC to try to sharpen the geocoding on those points. And then there'll also be a challenge process that relates to the speed declarations within any of those specific points. So how fast is the service that's there? So our job is to kind of get ready for all that. The challenge windows will be available this fall, starting this fall. So FCC is still collecting data. They'll then publish a map in the fall, and then they'll go through a public challenge process. They'll have to adjudicate those challenges, and we're definitely in 2023 before they'll publish a new map. I would be reluctant to tell you exactly when that's going to happen because I think that it's an open question, and I'm glad I don't work for the FCC trying to do a nationwide map. So that, however, final publication of the map is going to trigger all of these other events that start to happen with the federal funding programs. So once they adopt the map, then we'll find out how much money each state gets. And so all of that will happen in 2023. Concerning legislation, right now we're very focused on the implementation of the federal program. So that's where my focus is. I know broadband's always a hot topic, so I'm sure that there will be lots of activity in state legislatures and in Congress as we go through the next year, but not ready to know for sure what those things will be. So we're certainly looking at ways we can improve and be better, and ways our state programs can grow with us. And one of those areas certainly is moving from census block-based mapping to location-based mapping. So that could be a topic of conversation, but too early to know for sure.
Thank you a lot. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question before I jump into mine?
This is Bill Mitchell. I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I have a friend lives in Dane County on a farm. I'm sure that when the government gives money to Spectrum and TDS, they run broadband everywhere and they run it past the driveway and say, oh, that's good. Now pay me $10,000. I'll run it to your house. Is there anything that private individuals can do to They can't afford $10,000 to run a cable to their house. What is there anything that we can do to help them, I guess?
Well, since I think Dane County's in Wisconsin. Is that
Correct.
well, I don't know.
Dane County is where Madison is located.
Yeah. So I will stand by to see if my
So
colleague
this
from
farm
Wisconsin
is
wants to
located
answer.
literally 3 miles from a large city, and they won't run broadband to their house because, well, I suppose they don't get money to do it. It goes right by their driveway, but the end of the driveway is quite a ways from the house.
Sure, I
So
can maybe.
they currently have 3K service from a local telco.
Maybe I can jump in. This is Alyssa from Wisconsin. And so in the last biennial budget, Governor Evers did propose a line extension program. So a grant program sort of for that specific issue of, you know, the cost basically from the road center line to the household. It was not approved by our state legislature as a grant program, but it has been proposed by the governor to sort of, we understand that sometimes there's a large cost. With the state broadband grant program, the projects go to the home or to the premise as long as the customer subscribes. And so if it's received state broadband funding and the customer has subscribed to the service or opted into service, then the grant program brings it all the way to the premise, whether that be a business or a home. But if it was a sort of existing facility and now it needs to be extended down a driveway or something like that, the cost does fall to the customer. And we understand as a broadband office that can be really a big burden, and that the governor has proposed a line extension grant program, but it was not approved in the last budget.
One thing that I would add to that, you know, obviously we have the same sort of problems in Iowa from time to time. And I'm observing I mentioned the FCC challenge process that's going to be used to make determinations about availability, you know, whether you're served or unserved. They've introduced a challenge code that says if you know, you can challenge the map if the provider demands connection charges that exceed its standard installation charge. Now, I'm not an attorney, and I certainly don't want to be in the business of interpreting FCC codes, but it's interesting to think about if the provider did say to you, hey, you know, it's $10,000. If that's not a standard connection charge, whether that could be grounds for you to claim that you are in fact unserved. So there are things like that you may want to, you know, share with your broadband office. Certainly, we'd want to know about those things in Iowa to see if that might help through our appeal process. We would want to know that, and we're going to ask the public to tell us that so that we can make the case to the FCC that if you're in that condition, you're in fact unserved and thus should be eligible under the future grant programs.
Thank you so much. We did have a raised hand by our executive director of our foundation, Julie Bauer.
Thanks, Griselda. And again, thank you to all three of you. My ears certainly perked up as I heard community shared various times. Our work very much is tied to Alliant Energy's service area, which of course is in Wisconsin and Iowa. And this whole conversation around digital access and equity is part of our giving strategy. So I guess I just wanted to kind of see maybe if any of you could maybe get into it a little bit more. Kind of when you think about engaging the community, um, how are you thinking about doing that, and just the importance of it? I certainly know it's very important to us. I just would be curious, just some additional thoughts if you have them.
So Matt and Lizel. Lisa.
So yeah, I didn't want to step over someone else who had more interesting thing to say than me, but so we are looking at it comprehensively. What we know is that we have to demonstrate to the federal government that we have community engagement across a range of fronts. So for example, we are going to be required as a condition of receiving planning funds under BEAD, under the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, to create a broadband strategic plan for the state that addresses 13 discrete elements, many of which articulate broad community coordination. I think there's a lot of ways that you can do that. So We will be working with a number of different local groups to help us coordinate those activities. And we've already had some meetings with those different organizations. And I can envision, it's early days, but I can certainly envision lots of different types of outreach that can occur, whether that's a local town hall meeting, a roundtable discussion, different panels and governance groups that exist to help fund or to help focus the broadband program. We're still in the process of building that model. But simultaneously, we want communities to be involved in the decisions about allocations. And that's really going back to that invitation to qualify process that I talked about in my slides. We are seeking an approach that really lets the communities decide where the funding should go. And so that involves putting communities in the driver's seat to help us pick project areas and helping to gather information about the specific needs within their communities. And so that's this next phase for us, is that journey to create a program of effort where it's communities, not broadband providers necessarily, but communities who are really in the driver's seat to say, this is where the urgent needs are in the state, and here's why they're urgent. So I think it'll be both pieces, but that will most likely be our approach in Iowa.
Thank you, Matt. And Liesl, I'm curious to see if you have some thoughts on that, given that you kind of help with Empower Rural Iowa, and you're kind of looking at it from 3 different prongs. Curious on some thoughts for Julie on the importance of connection in our communities.
Yes, absolutely. And it's been interesting over the past few years since Empower. We do have the 3 task forces that all meet individually to address their various topics. And actually, this is the first year where we're having more combined meetings than separate meetings, because we are seeing the need to make sure that everyone is aware of all the other pieces. It's impossible to talk about attracting new residents or workers to communities without also talking about if there's broadband connectivity there or housing. So really kind of having a better understanding of how all those pieces are working together. And I have been in touch with Matt's team. I think early on when they were talking about this discussion, they touched base with me to talk about other networks that I think should be part of this conversation regionally. And we talked about even things like council of governments, because they have very much a role in our rural areas. We talked about some of the foundations even are getting really involved in economic development. Our economic development groups, our business entity is very interested and involved in making sure that broadband is touching everything. So I think the biggest takeaway we've had as far as getting the communities involved is really understanding that we need to kind of maybe step outside of our lane a little bit and understand the crossover and how we all need to be better understanding of how all these pieces are fitting together, and not just stay, super pigeonholed in, hey, I do housing, I don't really care about all that other stuff. And that's really, I mean, if we're talking regionally or even down to individual communities, those that are thinking more outside the box and willing to kind of swerve into other lanes are those that are seeing the most success. So, and in that way, I'm actually, again, super excited about what OCIO is doing and the groups that they're working with and engaging with, because it is more unusual than kind of just chatting with the providers who speak the broadband language. It's trying to break down and learn each other's languages.
Thank you, Liesl. And Alyssa, I know just last year you launched the broadband task force through your office. And, kind of tying into Julie's question is, how do you ensure then that you have the accurate representation on a new task force where people might have a lot of ideas and opinions, and maybe share a little bit about what you're leading in that space too?
Sure. So the commission is staffed to the governor's task force on broadband access. And this most recent report actually fits nicely with the previous question. They really focused this year on active network building and community alignment. And communities have long been part of the state's broadband grant program. Grant applications that come in as a public-private partnership get additional points. And as an office and a staff, we've really found that projects where the community is helping identify the need and the provider is providing kind of the network design and the cost analysis are really the strongest and most accountable projects. And so for a long time, Wisconsin has made it a priority to fund those projects. But with the influx of money and some communities continuing to just have a struggle to identify the provider to work with or to really dig in, I think we see twofold. One is that communities need to have access to good technical assistance so they can come to the table with the provider community and be on equal footing, understand sort of the basic technology, network design, financing, sort of underlying pieces. And then that it really needs to be, the community needs to have a lot of voice, just as Matt was saying, about where the project is. Communities, by and large, are very concerned about every resident in their political subdivision, town, county getting service, and they're planning for everybody. They're not planning for kind of the next best economic locations based on their company. They're planning for their community. And so that community engagement is just so deeply critical. So we see it really as kind of a two-part. One is that technical assistance, and two is really driving grants where communities are part of the design. And then also communities are taking a role in kind of the accountability on the back end to help make sure that the grants are built.
Thank you so much. We do have one question in the chat from Leon Swan. And the question is, do you have the ability to objectively evaluate individual broadband performance? He's thinking individuals logging into a central site and evaluating their interaction. Matt, Alyssa, Liesl, any thoughts on that question?
I can offer maybe an incomplete thought. One of the enduring challenges of broadband programming, like the BEAD program or the state and the federal programs we've run in the past, is that objective component, because there's always a dispute about whether a measurement taken within a home is burdened by the equipment inside the home, and whether it accurately represents the conditions of broadband, as up to the house, in effect. So if you're measuring inside the house, is your computer slow? Is your Wi-Fi network, optimally configured? Those are confounding factors that have limited, to a certain extent, the veracity that's given to speed tests. What I think is happening increasingly, though, is there's still a desire to gather that data and use it to inform decision making, even though it's incomplete. And so, as I mentioned, when we're doing our MAP appeal process, we're going to gather speed tests because we think that that's an important input into a broader and more holistic understanding of the conditions of broadband in any area. It may, in fact, be true that a speed test at one home is slow because of that user's equipment. But if a speed tests in a neighborhood or in a part of a city are collectively slow, that may inform some of our thinking about other questions to ask. So that's kind of one answer I would give. And the second is, we reserve the right and do conduct field testing to, visually inspect and measure the conditions of broadband networks in the field, especially in circumstances where we have cause to question the claim that a provider makes. We'll also do that in a circumstance where a resident who was supposed to have been served by a grant that we issued notices us that, in fact, the service never materialized. So there are lots of things in the field that we're also doing to try to get a handle on what that is. I don't have a perfect answer, and I'm not sure if the industry does, but that's our approach and how we're trying to get towards some answers to what's actually happening in the field.
Thank you, Matt. Any other thoughts on that question? Now the chat is kind of blowing up, but I want to be mindful of time. So I'm not sure if Alyssa or Liesl, you have any more thoughts on that question. If not, I will move to ask each of you to give some closing remarks. And there's a question in the chat that I think fits perfectly to getting you to that. It struck me, kind of in your remarks and in the presentation and the comments that we have to look at this holistically, right? And there's access, affordability, and Matt, even when you said that the term digital divide, right, is kind of not as inclusive as it could be because there's social, economic, digital skills, access, and affordability. And there's a chat question from John Borman. So tying all in, right, solving the digital divide, we're all working towards this goal. His question is, and I'll ask you to tie that into your closing remarks, how long do you think it will take before the majority of rural households and communities will have broadband access? That's a loaded question, but I think it ties nicely into all of the work you're all doing. And I'll start with Liesl. I'd like to start back to front now.
Oh, great.
No
So,
pressure, no pressure.
um, well, that is definitely a loaded question. I am honestly not, I mean, I'm not sure I'm equipped to be able to give an amount of time, but I do feel like we are definitely moving in the right direction. I mean, specifically in Iowa, the amount of funding that has gone into broadband expansion in just the past, I believe we have had 7 rounds, I think you said, Matt, since 2018. That's huge, and that's definitely going to just continue to move the ball forward. And I, in my work since 2019, have seen huge success in areas around the state. So yes, can't tell you how long it will take until we've hit that last farm or that last business, because those are some of the most challenging as we're kind of getting further and further out of the more populated areas. But I can say I think the direction that we are going in and needing to go in, and it's exciting to see, is kind of putting all those pieces together. So you have it, now what? So it's really kind of understanding how all of that works together and continuing to see broadband as like a required utility. It's no longer kind of a, fun cherry on top. It's really a requirement. How many businesses I talk to where they can't expand, not only because of workforce, which is a whole different webinar, but because of broadband connectivity, they just don't have the ability to expand. So kind of seeing some of those pieces where once they get that service, they're able to grow their business, and in those rural areas is really the goal. So looking for that, and looking for, as we're expanding our kind of that telecommuter lifestyle, that remote worker lifestyle, being able to offer the ability for people who don't want to live in urban centers to live and experience these rural quality of life, but have that connectivity. That is the goal. So I know I totally did not answer your question, but grateful to be here with these panelists, and looking forward to kind of the future of broadband in both of our states.
No, I think you answered it perfectly, right? It's almost like a moving goal, right? And it's never going to be 100% solved. Well, maybe Matt, you're going to help solve it, right? In all of Iowa, right?
Well, Liesl did a great job. We get that question a lot, and the truth is, it is a moving goal. When I first started in this program, broadband was defined in Iowa as 25 megabits per second down and 3 megabits per second up. Today, we're seeing requirements in some federal programs for symmetrical 100 megabit per second build out, and that's over the course of 5 years. I think maybe the better question is, that rather than when is it going to be done, is to begin framing this as a journey that we're all going to go on together. Because what we're really focused on when we say broadband, such a fluid term, is the speed levels that you need to participate in the information society. And it turns out that changes over time. The speed levels that you needed 10 years ago when you were, browsing a website predominantly are very different than the speed levels that you might need today when you're streaming 4K or 8K video. And they're going to be different 10 years from now, those requirements are, than they are today. So I'm not enthusiastic about fixed points that say now we can say that it's done, because I think it's going to be a continuous journey as we change our expectations about what we need from the internet as we use it for new and different things, which is not a satisfying answer if you're sitting at home today and you don't have a connection. The funding that the more precise answer would be a number of these programs, including the bigger ones that are coming from the federal government, generally prescribe about a 4-year time horizon. So we're looking out at 2027 before those programs must be complete. We're also facing any number of crises inside of the telecommunications marketplace that are going to affect timeframes. It's hard to find components that are necessary to build the broadband network today. It's very difficult, at least in Iowa, to find subcontractors to do the construction of networks. I'm seeing some reports of 2-year order turnaround times on fiber optic cable. All of that puts pressure on the timelines to get the programs done that we know are out there right now. So it's a tough question. It's a good question, but I think the broader challenge is to think about this as a journey that's really going to have to be evaluated and reevaluated over time. In part because that 100 meg connection you're going to get today may not, in fact, be be sufficient for that use case that you have 10 years from now.
A great way to put it, Matt. And I think COVID, right, accelerated, right, the way we are looking at what we need and how we're going to move our communities forward. Alyssa, closing thoughts, remarks based on that question and what your colleagues have shared?
Sure, thank you. And thanks so much, everyone, for being here today. I just wanted to sort of re-emphasize one of the things Matt just said is I've been in this job for 2.5 years, and the goalposts have changed by 400% of what broadband is, right? And so it's really difficult to necessarily make estimations, but maybe what I wanted to say is time and money alone will actually not solve this problem. There's things that need to happen within communities. There is engagement. There is participation by private industry. And in some cases, there's rules that we need. So private industry keeps broadband affordable, accessible, and continues to focus on adoption and equity. And so time and money are very important for solving this, but there's definitely other things that we're going to have to really keep our eye on and keep the pressure on to make sure that the service that public dollars goes to pay is really truly available and affordable to all of our residents, particularly the residents in our states who have just been historically marginalized and historically not connected for a whole variety of, institutional and historical reasons. But we have to focus these programs on them, and we have to make sure that everything we do is designed to ensure not just that immediate connectivity, but that long-term sustainability and access to the infrastructure for every resident in our states.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you to all of you who have asked questions. I know there's 2 more questions in the chat from Daniel and Shannon. We did capture those, so I'll try to get you some answers afterwards from the panelists, and I'll directly send those over to you. But in the interest of time, I want to make sure that I thank each and every one of you. Lisa, Matt, Alyssa, you guys are extremely busy. But I think hearing from both states, hearing from the efforts all of you are doing, and the importance of collaboration, right? I think all of you nicely work together, not only with each other's offices, but are really trying to figure out where the needs are for our communities. And I think that's equally as important. So I thank you on behalf of Alliant, on behalf of the broadband team, for all the work you're leading and for making the time to be here today, and to all of you. And we do host these quarterly. We do have our next speaker series set for September 14th from noon to 1. More details to follow. But I thank you all for being here. I'm glad we didn't have any technical issues. That's always my worry, right? We talk about broadband and then it doesn't ever fail. Someone has a broadband issue. And so we're not immune to it. But I thank you for your time. This won't be the last time you hear from me personally. Lysol, Matt, and Alyssa, and to all of you, thank you so much for being here, and to all of you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.